The phone buzzed insistently in my pocket, jolting me out of my focus. I wiped the sweat from my brow and stepped outside the makeshift clinic where the midday sun cast long shadows over the rural village. The name on the screen made my stomach sink. Andrew. I almost didn't answer. After years of dealing with my stepfather's antics, I knew calls from him rarely brought good news. But curiosity, and maybe a faint hope, got the better of me. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Olivia." His tone was cheerful, far too cheerful. "Just thought you'd want to know. I sold the mountain cabin." I froze, gripping the phone tighter. "You did what?" "Sold it," he repeated, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Don't look so shocked. It's for the greater good. Mine, obviously." He let out a smug laugh that made my blood boil. "My name is Olivia, and for as long as I can remember, Andrew has been the thorn in my side. My mom married him when I was 15. He quickly wormed his way into the family with charm and humor, but beneath that smooth exterior was a man who never hesitated to put his own needs first. The cabin wasn't just a vacation home. It was my sanctuary, a place I'd poured years of love and care into. Nestled in the mountains, it was where I went to recharge after grueling work trips. It was where I hosted friends for long weekends and felt most at peace. Hearing Andrew talk about it like it was just a pawn in one of his endless schemes was infuriating. "You had no right," I said, my voice shaking. "That cabin wasn't yours to sell." "Relax," he drawled. "I've been managing things around here while you're off saving the world. Besides, what's the point of holding on to something you're never around to enjoy? It was an easy way to clear my debts. You'll thank me later." "I'll thank you when hell freezes over." I hung up before he could say another word. Pacing back and forth, I tried to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Andrew's audacity knew no bounds, but this time, he'd crossed a line. What he didn't know, and what I intended to keep to myself for now, was that the cabin wasn't entirely mine to sell. My best friend Maya was co-owner. The legal agreement we'd set up years ago explicitly required both our signatures for any sale to go through. This wasn't over. I sat on the edge of my cot, staring at the phone in my hand like it might burst into flames. My mind raced, replaying Andrew's smug tone again and again. How could he think this was okay? Selling something so deeply personal to me as if it were a trinket he could trade for his own benefit. The cabin wasn't just mine. It was a lifeline. I spent summers there as a kid, chasing fireflies and hiking with my mom. After she passed, it became my anchor. The one thing that felt steady when everything else seemed to fall apart. Andrew, of course, had no such attachment. To him, it was just another resource to exploit, like so many things he'd meddled with before. But this wasn't some small favor or inconvenience. This was my home. I tapped Maya's name in my contacts and waited. "Hey, Liv, what's up?" She answered cheerfully. "Andrew sold the cabin." There was a long pause. "He what?" "Apparently, he needed the money to pay off some gambling debts," I said bitterly. "He thinks he can do whatever he wants. But I know our co-ownership agreement makes that impossible. He doesn't have the authority to sell it without your consent." Maya let out a low whistle. "He really thought he could get away with this? That man has no shame." "None," I agreed. "I'm going to need your help sorting this out. I'll finish my volunteer assignment and head back home as soon as I can. Can you pull up the legal documents in the meantime? I want to be ready to counter this when I get back." "You got it," Maya said, her voice firm. "We'll take care of this together." As I hung up, a strange sense of calm settled over me. Andrew thought he'd outsmarted me. He assumed I was too far away to do anything about his betrayal, but he didn't know who he was dealing with. I wasn't the scared teenager who used to let him steamroll me. I was an adult now, with resources, allies, and a firm grip on the law. If he thought this was over, he was about to get a rude awakening. The next few days passed in a blur as I wrapped up my volunteer assignment, trying to keep my emotions in check. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the thought of Andrew's betrayal lingered like an unwelcome shadow. I couldn't shake the image of him gloating about settling his debts at my expense. Late one evening, I sat down with my journal, something I always brought on trips. Writing helped me sort through my feelings, and I needed clarity now more than ever. As I scribbled furiously, the memories started flooding back. The first time I visited the cabin with my mom. The hours Maya and I had spent restoring it, peeling wallpaper, sanding old floors, making it ours. The quiet nights by the fireplace when the world seemed to stand still. This wasn't just a building. It was a piece of me. And Andrew thought he could just sell it off like a poker chip. Number not this time. Maya called again the next day, her tone brisk and businesslike. I went through the co-ownership agreement, she said. You were right, he didn't have the authority to sell without my consent. The sale's invalid. Relief coursed through me, but it was quickly replaced by anger. Do we know who he tried to sell it to? Not yet, Maya replied. But I pulled the county records. There's no official transfer of ownership. Sounds like he tried to do this under the table. Typical Andrew, always looking for shortcuts, always trying to outsmart the system. What's our next step? I asked. Well, we can either confront him directly, Maya said, or let the legal process handle it. Either way, we're in the clear. He doesn't have a legal leg to stand on. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Thanks, Maya. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'd figure it out, she said warmly, but you'll never have to. I've always got your back. As I hung up, a plan began to take shape in my mind. I'd finish my work here, return home, and face Andrew head-on. But I wasn't going to scream or yell. That's what he expected. I'd take a different approach. I'd use the one thing Andrew always underestimated, my ability to think ahead. He thought he'd won, but by the time I was done, he'd realize he'd underestimated me for the last time. When I finally arrived home, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The cabin always welcomed me with a sense of peace, but now that silence felt ominous. My houseplants were slightly wilted. The mail had piled up by the door. The fridge was practically empty. I set my bags down and exhaled, the weight of what I needed to do settling on my shoulders. Before I could even unpack, my phone buzzed. Andrew. I debated letting it go to voicemail. But no. It was time to face him. Well, if it isn't my globe-trotting stepdaughter, he said, his voice dripping with fake cheer. Finally back to reality, huh? What do you want, Andrew? I asked, cutting straight to the point. Oh, I just wanted to check in, he said, smug. Make sure you're not too upset about the whole cabin situation. I mean, it's gone now. No use crying over spilled milk, right? My jaw clenched. Funny you should say that, I replied, keeping my tone calm. Because, as far as I can tell, it's not gone. Maya and I checked the ownership records. The sale didn't go through. Silence. You can't sell what doesn't belong to you. I held the silence just long enough to let him know I'd struck a nerve. That's ridiculous, Andrew said, his voice tightening. The buyer paid in cash and the paperwork is handled. It's a done deal. No, it's not, I replied, keeping my voice steady. Maya and I co-own the cabin. Remember, without her consent, the sale is invalid. Legally, it's still ours. His laugh came sharp and brittle. You think you're so smart, don't you? Always playing the perfect daughter, always trying to control everything. His tone grew bitter. You don't know how hard I've had it, Olivia. I did what I had to do. No, I snapped, my anger finally bubbling to the surface. You stole from me, and you think I'm supposed to feel sorry for you? You've made your choices, Andrew. Now you'll have to live with them. The conversation ended with him hanging up on me. I stood there, phone in hand, shaking with a mixture of rage and triumph. For years, I had let Andrew manipulate situations, guilt-trip me, and take advantage of my patience, but not anymore. This wasn't just about the cabin. I wasn't simply defending property. I was reclaiming my boundaries, my voice, and my peace of mind. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, my laptop open in front of me. I reviewed the documents Maya had sent over. The co-ownership agreement was crystal clear. Neither of us could sell the cabin without the other's written consent. Andrew's actions weren't just unethical, they were blatantly illegal. I stared at the words on the screen, my frustration simmering beneath the surface. A sharp knock at the door snapped me out of my thoughts. When I opened it, there he was. Andrew, wearing that same smug expression he always did when he thought he was about to win. "Mind if I come in?" he asked, though he didn't wait for an answer. He pushed past me, making himself comfortable in one of my chairs like he owned the place. I folded my arms, leaning against the doorframe, watching him carefully. "What do you want, Andrew?" "Look, Olivia," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "I know you're upset, but you have to understand my position. I was desperate. The people I owed money to weren't exactly patient." I raised an eyebrow. "And you thought stealing my property was the solution?" "Borrowing," he corrected, as if that made it any better. "I was going to make it back. Once my luck turned around, I would have paid you back every penny." I laughed, bitterly. "Your luck? That's what you're betting on? Andrew, you've been gambling away money for as long as I've known you. It's never worked out. Why would this time be any different?" For a moment, he shifted uncomfortably. But then, as always, his bravado returned. "You're overreacting. It's just a cabin. You're barely even there most of the time. Why not let someone else make use of it?" "Because it's mine," I snapped. My voice echoed louder than I intended. "Because it's my home. You don't get to decide what I value or what I do with my property. And for the record, Maya values it just as much as I do." I stepped closer. "Your little sale, it's invalid, and you know it." His face darkened. For the first time, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear. You wouldn't really go to the authorities, would you?" His voice faltered. "You wouldn't ruin your own stepfather like that." I leaned forward, locking my gaze with his. "Try me." For the first time in my life, Andrew had no snappy retort. He stood abruptly, muttering something under his breath, and stormed out. The door slammed shut behind him. I sank back into my chair, my heart pounding. The confrontation had left me rattled, but beneath the adrenaline and nerves I felt something else, a spark of satisfaction. Andrew was starting to realize that his usual tactics wouldn't work on me anymore. This wasn't just about the cabin, it was about standing up to someone who had taken advantage of me for far too long. After Andrew's dramatic exit, I called Maya to update her. "He showed up at my house," I said, pacing the living room. "Tried to spin some sob story about how he borrowed the cabin to settle his debts." Maya snorted on the other end of the line. "Borrowed? Does he even hear himself?" "What did you say?" "I told him the sale was invalid, and if he pushed me, I'd go to the authorities." "That must have rattled him." "It did," I admitted. "But knowing Andrew, he's probably already scheming his next move." "Let him scheme," Maya said firmly. "We've got the law on our side. I've already contacted a lawyer to help us draft a formal cease and desist letter. If he tries to involve the buyer again, we'll have a legal paper trail ready to shut it down." Her words grounded me. "Thanks, Maya. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'd figure it out," she said warmly. "But we're in this together." Over the next few days, I focused on gathering all the evidence I could. I documented the co-ownership agreement, collected screenshots of text messages Andrew had sent about the sale, and even tracked down the real estate agent who had been involved. When I finally reached the agent, her voice was tense. "Look, I didn't know the full situation," she said quickly. "Andrew told me he had permission to sell. If I'd known the cabin had a co-owner, I never would have touched the deal." "Well, now you do," I replied, keeping my tone even. "I'm not trying to drag you into this, but I need your cooperation. Can you confirm that Andrew signed the paperwork alone?" "Yes," she admitted after a pause. "The buyer hasn't paid in full yet because I flagged the transaction as unusual. I can provide you with the documents if you need them." "That would be helpful," I said, jotting down her information. As I hung up, a renewed sense of determination settled over me. Andrew had banked on me being too passive or too far away to fight back, but he was about to learn just how wrong he'd been. That evening, Maya called with more good news. "The letter's ready," she said, her tone brisk. "We'll send it first thing tomorrow, and if he tries to pull anything else, we escalate." Perfect, I replied, a small smile creeping onto my face. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was gaining control of the situation. Andrew thought he could steamroll me, but he was about to find out that I wasn't so easily defeated. The next morning, Maya and I finalized the cease and desist letter and sent it to Andrew. The language was clear and unyielding. Any further attempts to claim ownership of the cabin or engage the buyer would result in legal action. I imagined his reaction when he received it. Probably a mix of outrage and disbelief. For years, he'd gotten away with manipulating and intimidating people into submission. But this time, he was up against a wall he couldn't charm his way through. Later that day, the real estate agent emailed me the documentation she promised. Seeing Andrew's signature on the fraudulent sale agreement made my stomach turn, but it also solidified my resolve. He hadn't just crossed a line, he'd bulldozed over it. That evening, my phone rang. "Miss Carter," a voice said. "This is Detective Miller. I'm a local officer Maya Langley contacted to assist with your case." His tone was calm, professional. "I've reviewed the documents you and Miss Langley provided. It's clear the sale was unauthorized. Based on the evidence, we can move forward with a formal investigation, if you'd like." "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I want to pursue this." "Understood," Detective Miller continued. "We'll start by contacting the buyer and explaining the situation. If Andrew continues to interfere, we'll escalate to criminal charges for fraudulent misrepresentation." "Thank you, Detective. Please let me know if you need anything else from me." As I hung up, I felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The wheels were in motion now, and there was no turning back. The next day, Andrew called. His voice was laced with anger, but there was something else there too. Desperation. "Do you have any idea what you've done, Olivia?" he demanded. "You're ruining everything." "No, Andrew," I replied calmly. "I'm protecting what's mine. You did this to yourself." "You've always been so ungrateful," he sneered. "I stepped in when your mom couldn't handle things. And this is how you repay me?" I laughed, bitterly. "You didn't step in, Andrew. You took over," I said, my voice steady but laced with years of buried frustration. "You manipulated, lied, and used people to get what you wanted. And now, you're paying the price." Andrew started to argue, but I cut him off. "This conversation is over. If you have anything else to say, take it up with my lawyer." Without waiting for a response, I hung up. Leaning back in my chair, I let out a deep breath. My heart was racing, but I felt it. Control. Andrew's days of pushing me around were over. I was finally in charge. 2 days later, Detective Miller called with an update. "Miss Carter," he began, his tone professional. "We've spoken with the buyer. They've agreed to halt the transaction. They were unaware of the co-ownership agreement and are willing to cooperate with any further investigation." Relief flooded through me. "That's great news. So, does this mean the sale is officially voided?" "Yes," he confirmed. "The cabin remains under your and Miss Langley's ownership. However, we'll need to keep the case open to address your stepfather's fraudulent actions. Do you wish to press charges?" I hesitated, but only for a moment. "Yes," I said firmly. "I want him held accountable." "Understood," Detective Miller replied. "We'll proceed accordingly. Thank you for your cooperation." After the call, I let out a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm returning. The cabin was safe, and Andrew's schemes, they were finally unraveling. Later that afternoon, I called Maya to share the news. "The sale is officially void," I told her, unable to hide the smile in my voice. "The buyer's backing out. The cabin is ours again." "That's a huge win," Maya exclaimed, excitement radiating through the phone. "But what about Andrew?" "The police are moving forward with their investigation," I explained. "He's not getting away with this." "Good," she said. "It's about time someone stood up to him." Her words stuck with me long after we hung up. For years, I'd let Andrew get away with so much. His manipulations, his entitlement, his complete disregard for boundaries. But this time, I'd fought back. And it felt like a turning point. not just for this situation, but for everything in my life. That evening, I drove to the cabin. It was the first time I'd been back since coming home. As I stepped inside, an overwhelming wave of emotion hit me. The scent of the wood panels, the familiar creak of the floorboards, the quiet hush of the mountains outside, all reminders of why this place meant so much to me. I sank into my favorite armchair by the fireplace, letting the stillness wash over me. This was my haven, the place where I built memories, celebrated milestones, and found peace in the chaos of life. And it was still mine. No thanks to Andrew. For the first time in a long while, I smiled. I wasn't just reclaiming a property, I was reclaiming a part of myself. A week later, Detective Miller called with the final update. "Miss Carter," he began, "I wanted to let you know that your stepfather has been formally charged with fraudulent misrepresentation and attempted theft of property. He'll be required to appear in court. Based on the evidence we've gathered, the case against him is strong." Hearing those words brought a mix of emotions, relief, vindication, and surprisingly, a touch of sadness. "Thank you for everything, Detective," I said sincerely. "You handled this situation with a lot of strength," he replied. "It's not easy to stand up to family, but you did the right thing." After the call, I sat quietly, letting it all sink in. Andrew had been such a constant presence in my life, albeit a toxic one. But now, I was finally free from his manipulations. The next day, Maya and I met at the cabin. She brought a bottle of wine to celebrate. We sat on the porch, the crisp mountain air carrying the scent of pine and earth. "To us," she said, raising her glass, "and to not letting anyone push us around." I clinked my glass against hers, laughing softly. "To us," I echoed. As we talked, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, I realized how much I'd learned from this ordeal. I'd spent so much of my life avoiding conflict, trying to keep the peace, especially with Andrew. But this time, I'd stood my ground, and it felt like a turning point, not just for my relationship with him, but for how I saw myself. "This cabin has always been more than just a property," Maya said, her voice soft but firm. "It's a symbol of everything we've built, everything we've worked for. Don't ever let anyone take that from you again." Her words hit home. The cabin wasn't just a house in the mountains. It was a reflection of my independence, my resilience, and my determination to protect what mattered most to me. Later that night, I sat by the fireplace watching the flames dance and crackle. For the first time in years, I felt a peace I hadn't known. Andrew's betrayal had tested me in ways I never expected. It had pushed me to the edge, forcing me to confront the parts of myself I had long kept quiet. But it had also shown me how strong I could be. The cabin was safe. My boundaries were firmly in place, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly in control of my life. In the weeks that followed, life slowly settled into a new rhythm. The cabin, once a battleground for Andrew's greed, became my refuge again. Each creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the trees outside, the soft hum of wind moving through the mountains, all of it reminded me of what I had fought so hard to protect. I didn't hear much from Andrew after the charges were filed, but one afternoon my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was hesitant, softer than I remembered. "You know how he gets, Olivia," she said. The same old defense of him, though this time it rang hollow. "I do," I replied evenly. "And that's why I did what I had to do." She didn't argue. For the first time, there was no attempt to guilt me, no desperate plea for reconciliation. Just a quiet sigh before she said, "I hope you find peace." "I already have," I said, and I meant it. Maya and I spent the next few weekends working on small renovations at the cabin. We painted the porch a soft blue, patched up the roof that had weathered too many storms, planted wildflowers along the edge of the property, violets, daisies, and lavender that filled the air with a faint, sweet scent. With every nail hammered and brushstroke applied, I felt like I was reclaiming more than just the space. I was reclaiming myself. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset dip behind the mountains, Maya turned to me with a knowing smile. "So, what's next for you, Liv? You've taken back the cabin, stood up to Andrew. What's the next big move?" I thought about her question for a moment. The answer came with surprising clarity. I am going to keep doing what I love, I said. Volunteering, traveling, living my life on my terms. But this time, I'm not letting anyone else dictate how I live it. She smiled, raising her glass. To that. I clinked mine against hers, the sound soft and satisfying. As the days passed, I found myself reflecting more and more on everything I learned from this ordeal. It wasn't just about the cabin. It wasn't even about Andrew. It was about realizing my own strength. For years, I had let his behavior dictate how much I pushed back, how much I tolerated just to keep the peace. But now I knew. I was capable of setting boundaries and holding them, no matter how uncomfortable it made others. The cabin stood as a symbol of that growth, a reminder that I didn't have to sacrifice my peace or my values for anyone else's comfort. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, I stood on the porch, breathing in the cool, pine-scented air. The sky blushed with streaks of pink and gold, the last light lingering on the horizon. For the first time in years, I felt truly at home. Not just in the cabin, but in my own life. If there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's that protecting your peace is non-negotiable. Life will always bring people who try to take advantage of your kindness or test your boundaries. But you have the power to stand firm. Never let anyone convince you that you're asking for too much by demanding respect. Your voice matters. Your space, your dreams, your happiness, they all matter. It's okay to walk away from situations or people that no longer serve you. Stand your ground even when it's uncomfortable. In doing so, you'll discover a strength you didn't know you had. Reclaiming my cabin wasn't just about saving a home. It was about reclaiming myself. So live your life on your terms. Be bold enough to protect what's yours and gentle enough to give yourself grace. Thank you for listening to my story. I wish you all the best. Good luck on your journey.